We are on DAF Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. Hope everyone had a meaningful Tisha B'Av. We're in the middle of a discussion that requires us to be very precise about our review of it. Let's make sure that we understand the brisa that we've been discussing up until now. The brisa talks about a tanur, an oven, that has been fueled by an Isser Hana. Here we're talking about klipe orla, or kashe kile hakerem, which is, let's say, nutshells from an orla tree, or the chaff of wheat that was growing as kilayim. Those things are asr bahana, and you've used them as a fuel to burn your oven. So the brisa had said that if this is the first time you're burning your oven, so you've tempered the walls of the oven through this isser hana, and as a result the halacha is that the oven has to be broken. Then the brisa had addressed the issue of the bread itself. The bread itself is a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda had said that the bread is aser, and the Chachamim had said that the bread is mutter. And the Gemara had questioned, why is it that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, why Rabbi holds that the bread is aser? Because the Gemara was trying to identify the Tanakama who says that when the oven is hardened by the Isser Hana, you're never allowed to use that oven ever again. So the Gemara had said it sounds like Rebbe is the author of the Reisha as well, of the first part of the Brisa that says that just like Rebbe says the bread would be aser, so too he would say that the walls of the oven are going to be aser as well. Comes along the Gemara and says it ain't necessarily so, because Rebbe indicates to us that he agrees that the bread is aser because the energy that is generated from the wood or the nutshells are exactly like the nutshells themselves. Like the way I would present it to you is that Rebbe holds of Einstein's theory of conservation that equals mc squared. In other words, when you have energy that is a product of a mass, so that you see the energy is just a converted form of that mass. So therefore, just like the mass, the fuel source is in Isser Hana, the energy is just an altered state of that Isser Hana, and it goes into the bread, so the bread actually contains within it an Isser Hana. The way that the Gemara presents that information, it says, Yesh shevach eitzim b'pas, that you see that the bread has been enhanced by the wood, or by the forbidden substance. The Chachamim disagree, and the Chachamim say that because the energy that is a result of the forbidden substances is an altered state, it's no longer the original substance, and therefore there's no Isser Hana in there. So clearly, the Chachamim cannot be the Tanakama of that Brisa who say that the walls of the oven are permanently Aser. But the Gemara wanted to argue that even Rebbe would not argue that the walls are permanently Aser, because when you want to bake new bread, you're going to be using permitted fuel. And that permitted fuel, only when it's combining with the contribution of the hardened walls of the oven, are what causes the final baking of this new product, the bread. That's what we call ze vaze goreng, that you have two substances that contribute to the production of the bread. One is a forbidden substance, namely the walls of the oven, and the other is the new fuel, which is a permitted substance. Where do we ever see that Rebbe goes so far to be machmir that when even you have a combination of permitted and forbidden substance, that the two of them contributing will prohibit the product? That's the Gemara's question. The Gemara had concluded that the author of the Reisha, therefore, is not necessarily Rebbe, but rather it's Rebbe Eliezer. Rebbe Eliezer says, Zev Zegorem is Aser. At least he seems to say that way according to Abaya. Because Rebbe Eliezer was talking about in a case of the Brisa, where you have two types of yeast. One is Truma yeast and one is Chulin yeast. And the two types of yeast, neither has enough to leaven the dough in question, but when you combine the two, they do have enough. The way that Abaya had understood Rebbe Eliezer is that when the two of them are in the dough together, then they make the dough aser, because he holds zev zegorem is aser, that when you have one is forbidden and one is permitted, but combined they are manifest in the product is going to be aser. Okay, that's the way Abai had understood Rebbe Eliezer. Now, that's not necessarily how you have to read Rebbe Eliezer. Rebbe Eliezer could be understood. You see, the case is that Rebbe Eliezer says you look at the yeast that was put in last, because the yeast that was put in last is the final oomph that leavens the dough, right? And so Rabbi Eliezer says that if the last yeast that was put in was the forbidden yeast, it's aser. If the last yeast that was put in is the permitted yeast, then the dough is mutter. Abaye had said that that's only when you removed the forbidden yeast that you put in first, and then you put in the permitted yeast. But if both of them are in there together, then Rabbi Eliezer would hold it's always aser. That's where we're up to in the Gemara. That Abaye understands Rabbi Eliezer is saying zev zegorem is aser. Comes along the Gemara at this point and says, Umimai, we're on the fourth line of DAF Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. I hope that's been a thorough enough review. That's really what you need to get in order to go through the next DAF today. Umimai, the time of the Rabbi Eliezer ke Abaye. How do you know that Rabbi Eliezer's reason is as Abaye had portrayed it? Dilma time of the Rabbi Eliezer mishum da achar acharon aniba lo shna kadam vesilik esa iser lo shna lo kadam vesilik esa iser aval bevas achas achanami deshari. How do you know that Rabbi Eliezer's reason is as Abaye had portrayed it as Zev Zegorem? Maybe Rabbi Eliezer holds that it makes no difference whether you remove the forbidden yeast or whether you left it in. You always look at the last yeast that was put in, which has the necessary oomph to be able to leaven the dough. And that's what Rabbi Eliezer establishes as his criterion, such that even if you have the forbidden yeast in there together with the permitted yeast, it's still going to be okay. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer doesn't hold of Zev Zegorem as Aser the way that Abaye portrays him. So you don't have really a raya that the author of the Reisha of our Brisa is Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara answer is Ela Rabbi Eliezer da Atzei Ashiras. But we have another statement of Rabbi Eliezer in another context in Avodah Zarah. Ditnan, as the Mishnah in Avodah Zarah says, Notol heimena eitzim asurim bahana, that if a person breaks off a branch of an Asherah tree, which is an Avodah Zarah tree, so then those branches are asur bahana, hisik bahana satanur, and if you use those branches to fuel an oven, so then chadash yutatz yashan yutzan. If it's a new oven, like we said, you're hardening the walls with this Avodah Zarah wood, so then it's going to be forbidden. Yashan Yutzan, but if it's an old oven, meaning it's already been hardened, so then you just have to wait till the oven cools off before you can use it again. Afa boes hapas asurin bahana. If you use the oven to bake bread, the bread is asur bahana. Nisarva ba'acheros va'acheros ba'acheros. If the wood gets mixed in with other wood, that's permitted. And then a small portion of that mixture gets mixed in with other wood, it's kulan asurin bahana, then everything is asur because Avodah Zarah wood never becomes bottle. Avodah Zarah items never become bottle. And Rabbi Eliezer Omer, yolich hana liyam hamelach. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with that, and he says that no, you can take the amount of wood that you calculate was from the Asherah tree in this entire mixture, and take that and use that as sort of like a pidyon, as a redemption for the Avodah Zarah wood wherever it is, and dispose of that in the ocean, and the rest of the wood is okay. Amrulo ein pidyon la Avodah Zarah. And the Chachamim disagree with him only on that point, and they say, no, you can't redeem Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah, wherever it is permanently asur and is never bottle. But what you do see is that Rabbi Eliezer agrees with the first part, with the Chachamim. And Rabbi Eliezer holds that the oven, if the oven is tempered by the Avodah Zarah wood, then that Avodah Zarah wood will permanently asur the oven, even though the next time you use the oven, you'll be using permitted fuel. So you see that he holds Zev Zegorem as asur. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, not necessarily so. Eimer deshamas le Rabbi Eliezer ba'avodah zarah dechamiri surah bishari surn shebetorah mishamas le. Maybe Rabbi Eliezer is only machmir to say Zev Zegorem is asur with the most stringent of prohibitions, which is avodah zarah. Where do you see that he holds that as well when it comes to lesser prohibitions like orla and kilei akerim? So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, Ela im kein aman teramiyeh. Well, first of all, says the Gemara, if you're going to create that distinction, then you're going to get stuck in finding an author for the first part of our brisa. So why create those unnecessary distinctions if we have no other alternative? That's our first question. Our second question is, Va'od hatanya behedja, and furthermore, if you really are going to push me against the wall, I have a brisa. The brisa does say explicitly, V'chein haya Rabbi Eliezer oser b'chol yisurin shebetorah. The Rabbi Eliezer, according to the brisa, not only forbids the oven when it comes to Asherah wood, but even when it comes to other forbidden substances that are asur bahana, he's also going to tell you that you have to break the oven if it was tempered by the isur hana. Amar Abaye. So now Abaye wants to clarify this further. He says, look, so we figured out that the authorship of our Reisha could be Rebbe Eliezer, who holds Zeva Zegorim as Aser. If you recall, previously we had tried to suggest that maybe the Shita of Rebbe, who says that the bread itself that is baked by the Aser fuel is Aser, maybe he's the author of the Reisha. The Gemara had said no, because just all we know from Rebbe is that he holds Yesheva Chaitzim B'pas, that you look at the energy created by the forbidden fuel as the forbidden substance itself, and it goes into the bread. But who's to say that he holds Zeva Zegorim as Aser? So Abaye says, Imtim Salomer Zeva Zegorim Aser Rebbe, Imtim Salomer Zeva Zegorim Aser, Kama, Rebbe Hainu Rebbe Eliezer. If you will attribute the Shita of Zeva Zegorim to Rebbe, then Rebbe and Rebbe Eliezer are the same, and the authorship of our Brisa, therefore, is Rebbe in the Reisha, and then a machlokus between Rebbe and the Chachamim in the Seifa. Ve'imtim Salomer Zeva Zegorim Mutter, v'hacha mishum d'yeshavach eitzim b'pasu. But if you're going to tell me that Rebbe only limits the prohibition to the bread because the fuel is the sole contributor to the production of the bread in that case, but in a case of Zeva Zegorim, Rebbe will hold its mutter. So now let's examine Rebbe's Shita, okay? So, Hani Ka'aros V'kosos Utzlochios Asiri, and Kipligi Betanur Ukedera. So he says then it'll turn out that the only time that there's a machlokes between Rebbe and Rebbe Eliezer will be when you have two items that are contributing to the production of the product, which means that when you have the hardened walls of the oven plus a permitted fuel source that are working together to bake this new dough, that's where Rebbe Eliezer will hold Zeva Zegorim as Aser, and Rebbe will say no, Zeva Zegorim is mutter. But let's say you have another substance other than an oven wall that is hardened by an Isser B'Hana'ah. Let's say you have plates, saucers, and bowls that are hardened by in the kiln by an Isser Hana'ah. There, Rebbe will agree that since the sole source of the hardening of this bowl is the forbidden fuel source, and when you use this bowl, you don't need another fuel source in order to use a bowl. If I want to have a bowl of cereal, I'm going to have a bowl of cereal without having to put it on a new fire. And therefore, the sole source of my benefit from this bowl, from this hardened bowl, is an Isser Hana. So Rebbe will agree that in that case we say Yeshevach Eitzim Bepas, or in this case Yeshevach Eitzim Bekosos or Bekaros, and therefore it's going to be Aser. The only time that Rebbe and Rebbe Eliezer will disagree is when the substance that I am using requires a permitted substance afterwards in order to be able to bake the bread. So for, let's say, an oven wall or a pot, let's say a pot was hardened through a forbidden fuel source, and now I want to make a soup. Well, since I need to put the soup over a fire, and the fire is going to be permitted, so then Rebbe would hold that it's okay to use the pot because it's Zeva Zegorim, and Zeva Zegorim is mutter. But again, when I want to use something that's, let's say, a cup for drinking or a bowl for eating a bowl of cereal, so then Rebbe would agree that that's aser.
But the pot's holding the whatever's.
Oh, 1 second, you're favorning. Laman domer zeva zegorim aser, laman domer zeva zegorim mutter shari. So again, according to Rebbe Eliezer, who says zeva zegorim is aser, so it'll turn out that the oven and the pot are going to be aser. But if you hold the zeva zegorim is mutter, so the oven and the pot are permitted. Ika da amri, others learn another way. Afilu laman da amr zeva zegorim mutter kedera asura. So this is exactly what Shlomi was driving at. That even if you hold that zeva zegorim is mutter, but a pot will be aser, even though you need to put it on a fire in order to cook the soup. Why? The hakibla bishula mikmei denitein eitzim deheteris. It's because there's a basic difference between a pot and an oven. For an oven, if I want to bake bread, I have to fire up the oven, and then I slap on the dough onto the side of my oven. So the new fuel source, which is permitted, is already part of this system when I'm adding my desired product to the system. But when I have a pot, and the pot has been hardened by an Isser Hana, when do I put my soup in the pot? Not after I've put the pot on the fire, but before I've put the pot on the fire. So at that moment, the pot is the sole contributor to the benefit that I'm getting in the preparation of this soup. And therefore, like Shlomi had suggested, the pot is acting as a holder, and therefore it's going to be usher as well, even if you hold zev gorim is mutter.
Does it matter that the fuel, when you stick your raw dough on the side of the oven, and there's no heat yet, you haven't used the fuel?
Obviously, you've never baked bread in an ancient oven before. Right. Go to Dr. Lafa. Ask them, can you put raw dough on a cold oven? They're going to say, what, are you crazy? You must come from Canada. Anyway, right? So obviously you can't do that. It just doesn't work. You would never do that.
So I guess it can't be so hot that it must be, is it actually fully hot?
Of course it's fully hot. Go to Dr. Lafa. You'll watch how they bake the... Yeah, they use an instrument to peel it off. Yeah.
Rabbi, I have a little question.
Yeah.
I was thinking that the fire itself destroyed the issue from the item where they put in the fire burning.
The fire burning. Okay, we're going to get to that, Mr. Gruda. Wait a few lines. It's an excellent point. The idea is that the fire sort of destroys the fuel source, so therefore the fire shouldn't be Asr Bahana anymore. That's exactly what the Chachamim hold. You saw this was the machlokus between Rebbe and the Chachamim. That's why I said that Rebbe is like Einstein, and the Chachamim hold that it's completely destroyed, and it's a new Zach that's here, right? So let's take a look. We're gonna examine this further. Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Tanur shehisiku b'klipi orla o b'kashin shel kilei hakerem chadash yutatz yashan yutzan. So Shmuel has a different version. He basically is quoting the Brisa. So far it's exactly like we learned in the Brisa, that when you have an oven that's been burned up, that's been fueled up by an Isser Hana'ah, so then if it's a new oven, it has to be destroyed. If it's an old oven, you just wait till it cools off before you can use it again. Afa boas hapas, Rebbe Omer hapas muteres, the Chachamim Omrim hapas asura. But here's where he digresses from our Brisa. He reverses the opinions, and he says that if you're baking bread in this oven, so then the bread is going to be a mutter according to Rebbe, and it's usher according to the Chachamim. The exact opposite of our Brisa, where Rebbe was the one who was the machmir, and the Chachamim were mekel. So v'hatanya ibcha. So the Gemara asks the question, but doesn't our Brisa have the exact opposite in the opinions? So the Gemara says, Shmuel ibcha tani. Shmuel had a different version of the Brisa. The way that he learned the Brisa was the opinions were reversed. Now here's the zinger. The ibayis ema ba'alma kesover Shmuel halacha karebi mechavero velo mechaverav uvaha afilu mechaverav the sover asnaya ipcha ki heichi denekum rabbanim liisura. This is a pretty astonishing statement when you think about it. But basically, the Gemara is suggesting Rebbe had this exact same version of the Brisa that we have. But Rebbe deliberately distorted the teaching of the Brisa. Why? Because Rebbe normally states, there's a general rule that Rebbe holds of that he taught all of his students, and that is that when there's a machlokus between Rebbe and one dissenting opinion, we paskin like Rebbe. But when there's a machlokus between Rebbe and the Chachamim, a group of rabbis, then we go like the rabbis. And here, Rebbe knew that the halacha was like, the Shmuel knew that the halacha is like Rebbe L'chumra over here, but he didn't want his students to err and think that because Rebbe is the Das Yachid, he's the sole opinion, and the Chachamim argue with him, that we have a right to be lenient like the Chachamim. And therefore he deliberately distorted and reversed the opinions of the Brisa so that his students would not be mekel when the halacha was that they have to be machmir. So therefore he said, I will deliberately distort the Brisa so that when they remember the Brisa, they'll remember that the halacha is like Rebbe, that you have to be machmir. And I will therefore give attribution to the Chachamim for this opinion. The reason why this is a little bit astonishing to me is basically Rebbe very clearly knows that he's distorting the Brisa. He knows what he's doing. And the Gemara says that that's okay. As long as he's doing it for the greater good of making sure that people don't make a mistake in the halacha, it's sometimes okay to change the girsa. So this obviously has limited applications, of course, but you have to think about this for a while and let it soak in. Let's go weiter. Okay, the Gemara now says, Bishla al gabi gecholam divrei akol apas muteres. The last part of the Brisa was that if you cook the raw dough on coals that are a product of this orla, this Isser Hana'ah, then everyone would agree that the bread is permitted. Why? Because by the time you expose the dough to the heat source is now completely carbonized. It's completely destroyed from its original state. And therefore, it's no longer considered the original Isser Hana. Something that Mr. Gruda was alluding to just a moment ago. Now, the question is, what is this altered state? At what level of carbonization are we placing the dough on these coals? Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel v'Rabbi Chia bar Ashi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. We have two groups of Amoraim who debate this issue. Chad Amar Lo Shanu Ela Gecholim Omamos, Aval Gecholim Loich Shos Asurin. The Chad Amar Afilo Gecholim Loich Shos Nami Mutarin. So the machlokus is as follows. At what state are these coals in? One opinion is that you can only have coals that are already smoldering, meaning that the flame is pretty much, there's heat in these coals, but there's no active flame left. And the other Manda Amar says, no, even if there's still active flame, it's still okay as long as the product has been carbonized. So it's really a question of how altered is this charcoal in order for it to be no longer considered the original product. So Bishlam Lamanda Amar Lochashos Asurin Mishum Diyeshavachaitzim Bepas. So I can understand the opinion that says that it's not okay if there's still active fire in these coals, because the fact that there's still active fire is a sign that not everything has been completely carbonized, and therefore you still have the original fuel source here. But if you say that even when there's still active flame left in these coals, then where does Rabbi ever say that yeshav achetzim bepas and therefore it's going to be usher? Under what conditions will the fuel source be considered to be a significant contributing factor to the bread? So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Papa kesha'avuka kenegdo. The answer is that when not only is there still a little bit of flame left in the coals, but when there's mamish, the wood is still there, really with a huge pyre, with a really big fire burning. There you can see the actual product is completely intact. That's where Rebbe says that the bread is going to be aser. So Michlal de Rabbanan de Pligi Alei Sharu Afilo Kishavuka Kenegdo. So it sounds like that according to the Chachamim, even when the fire is still intact, even when the wood rather is still intact and there's a fire emanating from it, we still say that even though the wood or the fuel source is aser bahana, the bread is still mutter. So under what conditions will the Chachamim ever find where wood is aser bahana, and yet under what conditions is that relevant? Because if you're going to tell me that whenever you burn wood, it's never you're deriving an energy from the wood, and you're not using the wood itself. So under what conditions is wood ever aser bahana? So the Gemara says quite simply, Amar Reb Ami Bar Chama Bishar Shifa. The answer is that when you're using the wood not as a fuel source but as a piece of furniture, when you take wood that's from an ashera tree or from orla, and you use it instead of fuel, but you use it as to make a stool out of it or a bench, that's when it's aser bahana. You can't sit on it. Ba'amine Rami Bar Chama me Rav Chizda Tanur shehisiku ba'atzei hekdesh ve'afa boas hapas. So now the question is as follows. He asked Rav Chizda, if you have an oven that instead of burning it out with orla shells or orla wood, you instead burn it out with bread. You burn it. Your fuel source is hektish, something that's been sanctified for the temple. The wood has been sanctified for the temple. Is it still going to be mutter? So l'Rabbanan desharu b'kamai samai. According to the Chachamim who say that with orla the bread is permitted, what will they hold in this case? So Amarlei hapas asuras. He said no. With bread, with the hektish, it's going to be aser. So the Gemara says uma ben zula orla. So the question then Rami Bar Chama asks, well, why is that any different from orla? So Amar Rava hachi hashta orla b'tela b'masayim hektish afilu be'elef lo batil. So Rava says I don't understand why he even bothering asking the question. There's a simple, obvious distinction between hektish and orla. Orla is an isser that can be batil. If you have a 200 times the orla is batil. But if you have hektish is never batil. Right? So obviously there's a distinction between the two. I can clearly see a distinction. So why even asking the question?
If it changed forms, you don't have to worry about bittul, though. I mean, this thing turned into such a change in the form of it.
No. So you're right. The Chachamim say that because it's changing its form,
right,
it's mutter. But if you want to ask, well, then why did they say by hektish it's aser? Because there's more of a reason to be machmir by hektish. Because we see the halachas in general of hektish were more machmir than orla. So the Gemara says, Ela Amar Rava ikashya leha kashya. So if Rami Bar Chama was questioning this, the reason why he's questioning it was as follows. V'halo ma'al hamesik. So the Gemara says, V'chol heicha demal hamesik nafkalahu l'chulin. The question that he was asking is as follows. There's a law of mi'ila. And we know that the law of mi'ila is that when you use temple property for your own benefit, so you have to bring a carbon. However, there's an important distinction to be drawn. It depends what kind of holy object it is. There's something called kedushas haguf and there's something called kedushas damim. When the object has intrinsic kedusha versus when the object has monetary kedusha. A sacrificial animal has intrinsic kedusha. It's not subject to pidyon. It can't be redeemed. But a piece of wood that is sanctified for the temple has monetary kedusha. And therefore, if you want to redeem it, it's subject to redemption. The halacha is, when I do an act of mi'ila on a sacrificial object that only has kedushas damim, so then as soon as I use it for personal use, I'm chayiv a carbon, plus the kedusha has flown off. The kedusha is no longer inherent within the wood anymore. So the question now is that as soon as I fire up this wood to bake my bread, by the time the heat gets into the bread, it's a chulin heat. It's no longer a hektish heat.
So why before you redeem it?
Yeah, no, I don't have to redeem it because the fact that I've used it for personal benefit, the kedusha automatically flies off.
That's why you have to redeem it.
No. It's not subject to redemption anymore. It becomes chulin automatically once I use it for personal use. It has become profaned. So through my taking of it for personal use, I have automatically profaned it. So the question, therefore, is the heat that is coming off of this burning wood should be chulin, and therefore, why should the bread be aser? That's the question that Rami Bar Chama is asking.
What's my reason? What's my reason for not doing such a thing?
You have to pay it back.
You do have to bring a carbon.
You got to bring a carbon.
You still have to bring a carbon.
Not redeeming.
You've incurred a liability because you've taken the kedusha away from the wood, so you have to
Bring a carbon.
But it's not a pid. You're not being paid.
Yeah.
Right. Amar Rav Papa, hacha ba'atse shlamim askinon va'aliba de Rebbe Yehuda. Rav Papa says, no, the reason why the wood in question still retains its kedusha is because we're talking about wood where the sanctification of the wood was for the purpose of using the wood to barter for an animal that's going to be brought as a korban shlamim. Now, a korban shlamim is what we call kodshim kalim. It's a lighter form of kedusha. There are two types of sacrificial holiness. One is kodshe kodshim and one is kodshim kalim. Rebbe Yehuda says, and the Gemara is actually adducing this from another statement of Rebbe Yehuda, but Rebbe Yehuda is of the opinion that kodshim kalim are not subject to the laws of mi'ila, whereby the kedusha flies off once I use it for personal use. And why? How do I know this? Because Rebbe Yehuda da'amar hektish b'shogeg mischalel b'mezid eno mischalel. That he says that the only time when I do an act of mi'ila, that the kedusha flies off the object, is when I use it b'shogeg, unintentionally. But if I intentionally take something that I know to be hektish and I take it for personal use, so there Rebbe Yehuda is of the opinion that the kedusha remains on even though I've taken it for personal use. B'mezid my time alo, kaven delaf bar me'ilahu. Why? Because Rebbe Yehuda says that the laws of me'ilah don't apply when I take something deliberately. The laws of me'ilah that are designated in the Torah, according to Rebbe Yehuda, only apply when I use it unintentionally. And therefore, the only time when the rules of me'ilah apply, that the kedusha flies off, is only when I do it b'shogeg. However, so lo nafik l'chulin. So shlamim nami kaven delav bar me'ilah inu lo nafik l'chulin. And in the same vein, that Rabbi Yehuda says that when I use something b'mezid, the kedusha does not fly off because it's not subject to the laws of me'ilah. So too by kodshim kalim, when I have wood that's been designated for a shlamim, which is lighter kodshim, those are not subject to the laws of me'ilah, and just like they're not subject to the laws of me'ilah, similarly the kedusha does not fly off. Basically, we're creating a scenario where the kedusha still remains in the wood even after I take it for personal use. And that's the answer to Rami Bar Chama's question as to why the bread will be usher, because even when it's converted into fuel, the fuel is still usher. Converted into energy, the energy is still usher. So now the Gemara says, but let me question the premise that you started with. You mean to tell me when it comes to a higher order of kachim, anytime I use the fuel for personal use and I burn it for personal use, it automatically goes for chulin? The Hatanya, didn't we learn kol hanisrafin efaran mutter chutz me'atzei ashera? We learned that anything that has been incinerated, even if it's an Isser Hana'ah, the ash is permitted. However, but that's not true by Atzei Asherah. If I burn the wood from an Avodah Zarah tree, the ash is still going to be Asr. The Efer Hektish La'olam Asr. But when it comes to the ash of Hektish, the ash is always prohibited. Now, according to what you just suggested, the ash, because it's in its altered state, should no longer be usher, and the question is, how can you tell me that whenever I use something for personal use and I burn it, let's say for personal use, it turns into chulin? It says over here that when I have ash of something that's hektish, it's always usher even after I use it, and presumably that's true when I use it for personal use. It still retains its kedusha. So how can that be based on what you just said? So Omar Rami Bar Chama kagon shenafla deleka me'eleha ba'atzei hekdesh deleka inish denimel. So Rami Bar Chama says, no, you don't understand. That Bryce is talking about not where a person burned something hektish for personal use. We're talking about a situation where a fire accidentally broke out and it burned something that was hektish. There was no act of me'ila. No one took the wood for personal use. That's why the ash remains in its kedusha state. But in achinami, if a person deliberately or let's say accidentally took the wood for personal use, then taka, the ash would be permitted. And Rav Shemaya Omar, ba'osin shetu'unin geniza. Rav Shemaya says, I have a different answer. The Brisa over there is talking about the ash of the Trumas Hadeshen. Only the ash of the Trumas Hadeshen retains its kedusha because there's a special gezeras hakasuv that even though it's in its altered state, it remains permanently kadosh because the Torah says that it has to go into geniza, it has to be permanently buried because no one is allowed to benefit from it. And the Tanya, as we learned previously, visamo benachas, the Torah says you shall place it down. You have to place it down softly. You can't throw it. Visamo kulo, you have to place it entirely down next to the mizbeach. And visamo shalo yefazer, and that you can't scatter it. That's what the word visamo teaches me. But visamo teaches me that only it retains its permanent kedusha, but other forms of ash that are a byproduct of something that's hektish, its kedusha falls off, and therefore it's not a question about me'ila. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ein biur v'chulei. Now we're going to go back to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah had started off by telling us that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the only way that you're allowed to properly dispose of chametz on Erev Pesach is by what? Is by burning it. You're not allowed to flush it down the toilet or throw it into the wind. You actually have to burn it. Now, where does he get this from? So Tanya, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, ein biur chametz el esreifa. He says that the only way to dispose of chametz is through burning. V'hadin nosein, and I'll give you a logical argument. Uma nosar she'eno b'bal yiro bal yimatzei ton sreifa chametz sheyeshno b'bal yiro bal yimatzei lo kol shekein sheton sreifa. Look, you have the din of nosar, the leftovers of a korban, which is past its expiration date. The Torah says that you have to burn it in order to dispose of it. There's no stigma of bal yirah, bal yimatzeh when it comes to nosar, that you're not allowed to have it in your possession, and yet the Torah says that the only way to dispose of it is through burning. So logically, kal v'chomer, that when you have something that has the stigma bal yirah and bal yimatzeh, surely we have to be machmir and dispose of it through burning. So amru lo, kol din sha'atadan tchilas lahachmir b'sofa lahakel eino din. So the Chachamim respond to him and says, you can't use logical arguments when there's a counter argument to be made in logic that's going to result, because of your chumrah, it's going to result in a kula. Now, what do we mean by that? Lo matzah eitzim l'sarfo yehe yoshev u'batel v'hatorah amar tashbisus or mibotechem b'chol davar shata yachol lahashbisa. So the Chachamim say to Rabbi Yehuda, it's going to turn out that your chumrah, that you can only burn the chametz and not dispose of it any other way, is actually going to turn into a kula. It's going to turn into a leniency. How so? Because let's say it's Erev Pesach and I can't find any wood to burn my chametz with. So according to you, Rabbi Yehuda, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to leave it over? And when the Torah says I have to dispose of it? So therefore, we maintain that disposal is any way you can dispose of it, you have to dispose of it. You can't bring me a logical argument that you can only burn it, because that logical argument is going to result in us being makel on the requirement of disposal of chametz. So therefore, no matter what kind of logic you bring, if that logic is going to end up in a leniency, then it's not a good logical argument.
Can't you just say one's the Chadchila and one's B'diavad? You should burn up the Chadchila, like Rabbi
You could if that's what Rabbi Yehuda had said, but that's not what he says. He says that the only way of disposal is through burning. So Chazer Rabbi Yehuda v'dano din acher. So Rabbi Yehuda changed his position. He presented another argument, and here, like Rashi explains, he's no longer using logic of a kal v'chomer, right? Of an what's it called? A fortiori, or I think that's what it's called. He's no longer using a kal v'chomer argument. He's now using a gzeira shava. He's using a gzeiras hakasa. He's using scriptural connections which are no longer subject to logical refutation. And therefore he states as follows: Nosar aser ba'achila v'chametz aser ba'achila, that both nosar and chametz are prohibited for consumption. Ma nosar b'sreifa v'chametz b'sreifa. Therefore, use nosar as your binyanav. Use it as your exemplar for every time that there's an isser in the Torah, where it's prohibited for achila. That just like nosar has to be disposed of through eating, through burning, so too chametz has to be disposed of through burning. So amrulo nevela tochiach shasura ba'achila ve'ena tunas reifa. Hey, I got other times the Torah prohibits things from being eaten, like nevela, where the Torah says throw it to your dogs if you want to dispose of it. There's no requirement of burning, so you can't use nosar as the exemplar for everything else. So amr lehen hefresh. But he said to them that, well, there's a difference between nosar and nevela. Nosar asur ba'achila uvahana, v'chametz asur ba'achila uvahana. The thing that makes nosar and chametz more comparable is not only are they both asur ba'achila, but they're both asur ba'hana. Ma nosar ton sreifa, av chametz ton sreifa. Therefore, just like nosar requires burning, so too does chametz. So amr lo, shor haniskal yochiach shasur ba'achila uvahana vein ton sreifa. Look at the shor haniskal, the animal that has to be put to death by stoning because it gored someone. In that situation, you're not obligated to dispose of the carcass through burning, and even though it's asur bahana, so therefore you can't bring proof from nosar to all other times that there's an isur hana. Amr lahen hefresh, but he said to them, but there's still a difference between shor haniskal and nosar. Nosar asur bachilo vahana va'anush kares, v'chametz asur bachilo vahana va'anush kares. He says the thing that makes nosar and chametz most comparable is because not only they're both asur bahana, but if you consume them, you get kares, and that's not true by any other isur. So ma nosar b'sreifa, chametz b'sreifa. So therefore, just like nosar has to be burned, so too chametz has to be burned. So they said no. Amrulo chelbo shel shor haniskal yochiach shasar b'achilo v'hana v'anush kares ve'in ton sreifa. So they said back to him, but still, what about the chelev, the forbidden fat of a shor haniskal? There's a punishment of kares for its consumption. There it's asur b'hana, and yet you don't have to dispose of it through burning. So again, your binyanav is not a good binyanav. So Chazer Rabbi Yehuda v'dano din acher. So Rabbi Yehuda changed his course of action, and he said, okay, I have another argument to make. Nosar yeshno bebal tosiru v'chametz bebal tosiru. Ma nosar b'sreifa av chametz b'sreifa. He says to them as follows. He says that, okay, fine, you're right. There's no, but there's another similarity between nosar and chametz. Nosar has the law that you're not allowed to leave it over. Chametz has the law of bal yira and bal yimotze, which is also a way of the Torah saying don't leave it over. So because they have that similarity, and they're both asur bahana, and they both have an isur kares, they have all of those things in common, and nothing else is in common like that. That's the reason why, just like by nosar you have to burn it, so too by chametz you have to burn it. And this is where we'll hold it for today. We're in the middle of the discussion. We'll continue here to Hashem tomorrow.